I've put this audio file together simply to keep a record, to show the similarities between my podcast, episode number 87, titled Last Stop, Diana the Hunter of Bus Drivers, from the episode in question. My episode was released on April 23, 2018, on my podcast, Once Upon a Crime. In it, I share the story of the missing and murdered women of Juarez, Mexico, and the vigilante who sought justice for them, a woman known only as Diana. The episode on Crime Junkie, which has now been pulled from their website and podcast feed, was originally aired on June 25, 2018, 2 months after mine, and was titled Conspiracy, the Women of Juarez. I've not included the entire episode, nor have I included every instance from where the side-by-side comparisons were very similar, if not verbatim. I cited my sources in the episode notes at the time. One of the resources I used was a 336-page book titled The Daughters of Juarez, written by Teresa Rodriguez and published in 2007. I only picked out some details of the book, obviously, to tell the story of the Juarez femicides. I also used a couple of hard-to-find articles, including some scholarly papers for some of the theories and statistics. As well, I put forward a couple of theories of my own in the episode, including the idea of the culture of machismo contributing to the inaction of the police and other authorities to solve the murders. Some of that came from my own personal experience as a Mexican American and personal knowledge of the culturally expected norms of that population. Mexican citizens were hungry for these jobs that paid more than they could earn in other types of work, provided air-conditioned factories to work in, and even provided meals. By the early 1990s, over 700 factories, or maquiladoras, were established in Mexican border cities.
In the early 90s, there were over 700 factories in the Mexican border towns, which drew people from all over for steady work. And often these factories were drawing young women because the conditions were so good. There was no heavy lifting, they were air-conditioned, and sometimes they even provided meals.
However, under the treaty, foreign companies were exempt from paying into local taxes. So while the population number swelled, there was not enough housing, childcare, or even basic utilities like water or electricity available.
But one thing to note is that these companies who were planting their factories there were providing work, but they weren't required to pay any local taxes, which meant that they were drawing hundreds of thousands of people to these cities, but not actually contributing any money through taxes back into the city structures.
Shantytowns sprang up on the outskirts of the city, where new residents quickly assembled shacks as makeshift homes. Many had no indoor plumbing, and electricity might be shared off a common generator, if there was any at all. Dirt roads miles long led to these communities. There was no public transportation that served these communities, so most of the residents traveled to and from city on foot. Once in the city proper, there were buses, but those without bus fare would walk the entire distance.
This forced people to live on the outskirts of the town and sometimes just in shacks. And again, there was no city infrastructure in these places, so there was no public transportation, and often women would have to walk to and from their homes to get to work.
There were over 6,000 bars operating in Juarez alone. These jobs could sometimes pay more than factory work, but it seemed riskier given the violence surrounding drugs and gangs that was all too frequent at these venues.
Now, while there wasn't a ton of city infrastructure, there were a ton of bars and restaurants that popped up around these factories. And now when I say a ton, I mean like thousands. So women would often find work in these factories, or they would find work in the bars and restaurants surrounding the factories. But the factory jobs were always considered to be the safer option because of all the violent crime that already existed in those areas.
The number of women employed outside of the home in Mexico grew at a rate that had never been seen before. Traditionally, in Mexican families, men served as the major breadwinners, while women stayed home and raised children, and perhaps did side jobs like cleaning, taking in wash, or sewing. Even when more opportunities arose for women to work, the culture of machismo, or men in the dominant power role, prevailed in many homes. It was seen as emasculating for men to allow their wives and daughters to work. In addition, women who wanted to work outside the home might be criticized as loose or sexually aggressive women, who were probably cheating on their husbands.
Now, with all of these new jobs for women, it really flipped everyone's world upside down because previously it was very common in Mexico for the men to work and the women to stay home, even in the late 80s, early 90s. And this new structure allowed women a lot more independence, but they were almost shamed for this. And they were accused of being essentially like hussies who were just out to cheat on their husband just because they wanted to get a job and help support their family and have a little bit of independence.
The girls fit a pattern. They were all young, in their teens and early 20s, although a few were as young as 10 or 11, and some over 30. They were all attractive, dark-haired women and girls. Most were morenitas, as they were called in Spanish, girls with dark cocoa skin.
Another hallmark of this case is the type of women that went missing and how they went missing. All the young women usually were from their mid-teens to their early 20s, but there were a couple of outliers who were as young as 10 or as old as their mid-30s. They all had dark hair, all were slender, and all had dark skin with brown eyes.
How they disappeared also seemed to follow a pattern. They were traveling alone, some on their way to work or school, or on their way home. They were traveling by bus or on foot. They would be taken while waiting for the bus or when they were walking to or from a bus stop.
Now, when they went missing, it was found that they were usually traveling alone, often by foot. They were either walking to their factory or to their restaurant job, or they were walking to a bus stop.
When they were found, most had been raped, brutalized, and murdered, mostly by strangulation. Their bodies were mutilated, either pre- or post-mortem. They were then dumped in the sandy weed-filled areas outside of town, in vacant garbage-strewn lots or in fields. Their murderers didn't even bother to bury most of them. They were hastily discarded, some within yards of businesses or busy streets.
Many of them were found raped or brutalized. They were often mutilated pre- or post-mortem and dumped just outside of the town, and hardly ever were they buried. They were just discarded, sometimes within yards of businesses or busy streets.
When the families reported the missing girls to the Juarez Police Department, they were quickly dismissed. Girls run off with their boyfriends or lovers all the time, they were told. They'd come home when they were done, quote, having a good time. The police then accused some of the women of being loose. A lot of these girls worked in the bars and nightclubs and lived secret double lives, they explained to their families. They were probably involved in drugs, they said. They said that some of them were, quote, probably prostitutes who didn't want to come home or had gotten involved with a drug dealer and were partying and didn't want their families to know.
Often these women and girls had been reported missing by their families, but police weren't taking these missing person reports seriously. The police were suggesting that these types of, quote, working women were loose, and basically they accused them of just living a double life, and surely they just ran off or got mixed up in the wrong things. And they're clearly gone crazy and tied up in drugs. Nothing bad could actually be happening. It's all their fault for wanting to be independent.
When they couldn't get the Juarez police to take them seriously, some traveled to the state police department to report the disappearances. The local police were not trained to conduct criminal investigations, but they could have reported the missing women to the state police and asked for help. Instead, the families had to do it themselves.
So police were just writing all of this off and not alerting any kind of higher authority. So the families took it upon themselves to contact the state police.
Invariably, days, weeks, or months after the women disappeared, they would be found murdered and left to rot in a field or empty lot. In 1994, no less than 10 bodies of young women were found within the Juarez city limits. Still, no movement was made to solve these crimes.
And often days, weeks, or even months after the girls were reported missing, their bodies would be found somewhere in the desert. And even after their bodies were found, the police were still victim blaming like crazy, basically saying that these women probably just got mixed up with something dangerous, and that's just that.
While some officers engaged in victim blaming, painting the women as responsible for their own murders due to their life choices, their mothers pointed out that a few of the murdered girls were prepubescent, only 10 or 11 years old. How did the police explain this, they asked. The finger was then pointed at the parents, particularly the mothers. They would say it was obvious that their mothers weren't caring for them correctly. the girls probably turned to others for care and attention, and that's why they could be taken advantage of.
And when the families of the younger victims would point out, like, hey, our daughter is 10 or 11, she's not working bars, she's not getting mixed up in any prostitution, nothing like that, then the police would kind of just turn it around and point that finger at the family saying, well, you probably just weren't a good mother. You probably weren't loving your daughter, and she was going to get...
What?
Yeah, they said that she was probably going to get affection from somebody else, and that person just took advantage of that.
Authorities would point out that there was a high crime rate in Juarez, and many men were also being murdered. The homicide rate was due to the warring drug cartels in the area, they explained. It's true that by 2008, due to the violent drug wars in the border city, Juarez was considered the murder capital of the world, with an average of 130 murders per every 100,000 citizens. However, the crimes against women in Juarez weren't simply shootings, as were the homicides that involved men. The attacks against women were sexually motivated, as well as brutal. Many of the women were raped, as well as mutilated, with their nipples or breasts bitten or cut off, and their genitals cut out. Many had been strangled to death, and sometimes stabbed as well. These were no ordinary drug murders, but rage-fueled, very personal attacks against women.
But police just kind of shrugged their shoulders and were like, meh, we live in the murder capital of the world. This is what you get, which is actually a thing. It was the murder capital of the world for a while, but they were basically just chalking it up to gang activity and saying, like, look, there's men being murdered too. And yes, there were men being murdered too, but the belief is a lot of those murders were drug or gang related because there was a big difference between the murdered men in Juarez and the murdered women in Juarez. All of the men had been mostly shot once, not a ton of torture. These women had been raped. They'd been brutalized. Their bodies had been mutilated. It was a lot more sadistic than just a fight over drugs or human trafficking or cartel stuff. This was so much more.
During a 4-month period between August and November of 1995, the bodies of 8 women were found in one area of the desert, located on the southern outskirts of the city. Even though there had already been 40 women murdered by an unknown person or persons in Juarez, when family members tried to report missing women, they were still being told to wait for 72 hours and then come back and file the report. Even then, it would sometimes take several more days before an officer would be sent to investigate.
Even with these 40 confirmed murders, as more women continue to go missing and more families come forward, police are still pulling the same stunt and saying they should wait and just see if they come back home. The murders aren't stopping, and in 1995, they find another 8 bodies all in one area.
There was at least one person in the state's attorney's office who was taking the murder seriously. Oscar Maynez Grijalva was a young criminologist who noticed similarities in a number of cases of murdered women in the state of Chihuahua. He began to work on the theory that a serial killer might be on the loose. After completing his analysis, he drafted a report that provided a psychological profile of the perpetrator and identified him as a likely serial killer. He presented his findings to his superior in the state's attorney's office in 1994, but was frustrated when he was simply thanked and his report was filed away.
And about this time, there's one man who's really stepping up and taking notice. It's a forensic investigator from the state's attorney's office named Oscar. He had access to all of the reports that weren't so readily available to the public, and he started drawing connections between some of the cases, and he concluded that yes, some of these women are likely the victim of a serial killer. He took his findings to his supervisors, and they said, okay, this is super duper. Thank you for your hard work. We're just going to file this report away, and goodbye.
In 1995, Maynez found that even more murders had occurred in the same manner and following the same pattern as those he had outlined in his report.
Throughout the rest of 1995, there were more murders that fit the exact same pattern that he had outlined.
By mid-1995, the number of murdered women topped 100. Still no comprehensive investigation into these murders by either local or state police agencies had occurred. Then there was a break in the case.
At this point, there are over 100 total victims when police, who aren't really looking for answers, get a huge break that just drops in their lap.
In October 1995, a young woman reported that she had been kidnapped, raped, and held captive for 3 days in a home in an upscale area of the city. She took officers to the home of 49-year-old Abdul Sharif. Sharif was a scientist from Egypt who held a lucrative position as an engineer in one of the city's maquilas. The woman said Sharif had threatened to kill her and dump her body in the desert if she tried to escape. Even so, she had managed to escape on the third day. Sharif was picked up by police and arrested for rape and kidnapping. However, not long afterward, he was released when the woman recanted her report and then left town.
In October of 1995, a woman went to police and reported that 3 days prior, she had been kidnapped, raped, and held captive for the entire time, and she'd spent the last 3 days with her captor who threatened to kill her if she tried to escape. But somehow she was able to find a way to free herself and get to police. When she took police to where the man had held her, it was the home of an Egyptian engineer named Abdul. He was arrested, but he ends up getting released on the charges because the woman who had accused him recanted her statement and ended up leaving the city.
What?
Yeah.
But Sharif was now on their radar and was investigated further. It was discovered that he'd had 2 previous convictions for sexual assaults in the United States. He was also said to frequent Juarez's red light district. Several sex workers and other employees claim to have seen him with several of the murdered women in the downtown area.
When they look into Abdul's background more, they find that he had a history of assault in the U.S. And after asking around, different sex workers claim they saw him with some of the murdered women before they went missing.
At first, it seemed that Sharif might very well be responsible for the murders. The killings came to a stop after he was arrested in October, and there were no more murders of women reported in the first months of 1996. But by that spring, 7 more bodies were found about 20 miles north of the city and just off the highway. By the end of the year, 9 more bodies of young women would be found.
They get Abdul in jail, and for a minute, the murders stop, but just like a hot minute. He is arrested in October of 1995, and until April of 1996, there don't seem to be any related murders. So at first, everyone is sure that they have their guy and the city will be safe once more. But by spring, the real Ripper, or someone, is back at it, and 7 more bodies are found, and then eventually 9 more throughout the year.
Criminologist Maynes pointed out that the murders began occurring even before Sharif moved to the Juarez area. He knew that Sharif could not be responsible for all the dead women, and suspected the police were just trying to close their cases.
And of course, Oscar is quick to point out, like, hey guys, if you would have paid any attention, Abdul wasn't even in the country when these murders started. So maybe he killed this one girl, maybe he definitely abducted the other, but I don't know that you can say he did all of them.
With criticism growing against them, Chihuahua State Attorney General invited profiler Robert Ressler to join the investigation. Ressler was one of the original members of the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit and one of the very first criminal profilers. He had since left the FBI and was now consulting with various law enforcement agencies to help catch killers.
And the people of Juarez are wising up to this too, and they're outraged at this point. Clearly, the police don't have all the answers, but they're just calling the Ripper case closed. With all the public backlash, the authorities decide, okay, we will call in one of the OG FBI profilers whose name is Robert, and we're going to have him help us and see what he says. Robert was literally one of the first ever behavioral analysts for the FBI, and he had retired and was working as a consultant when he came in to help the state police.
His findings concluded that of the 160 murders that had occurred since 1993, 76 were linked by a common pattern.
He basically concluded that of all the murders that had taken place since 1993, he could conclusively say that 76 were linked by a common pattern.
Ressler suspected that 1 or more serial killers were active in Juarez. He believed the killer crossed the border from the U.S. into Mexico to select his victims. It was easier to find vulnerable women in Juarez who traveled by foot, alone in the dark.
He believed there to be one or more serial killers operating in Juarez, and he really believed that it was someone from the U.S. who had spotted easy prey and was coming over the border and just using Juarez as a hunting ground.
Oscar Maynez, the criminologist, agreed with Ressler's conclusion that a serial killer was responsible, but not that he had come from the U.S. He believed the perpetrator to be a Mexican citizen who was living and operating in plain sight, blending in easily with the population. A local would know the area well, where to take the women where he would not be detected, as well as the most desolate areas to dump their bodies.
Now, Oscar, that forensic analyst in Juarez, agreed on some points, but he firmly believed that they were dealing with someone in their own backyard. He felt like this guy knows the place well. He's comfortable dumping these women in different places. He has to know the area. And Oscar believed that he was just blending in with everyone else, like in the day-to-day.
There was hope, however, when the new state's attorney appointed a special prosecutor to the newly formed State Task Force for the Investigation of Crimes Against Women. Sully Ponce was eager to get started, but when she pulled the files on the now hundreds of murdered women cases, she found that more than 1,000 pieces of evidence that had been collected, including clothing and other items found at the crime scenes, had been burned. Robert Ressler's findings and reports as well had been tossed. She had to start from square one.
There was a new state's attorney coming in who wanted to do their own investigation. The problem was, when she went to do a reinvestigation, she found that over 1,000 pieces of evidence from crime scenes related to the cases had been burned. They had nothing, and they had to start from scratch.
Oh my God.
And still, the killings continued.
And the killings just continue.
The Mexican president reached out to President Bill Clinton to ask for help. In March, help arrived in the form of 4 FBI profilers on loan from the Behavioral Analysis Unit.
The federal government stepped in and got 4 FBI behavioral analysts, on loan from the United States.
Their final conclusion was that the murders were not connected. The FBI report states, quote, "The team determined that the majority of the cases were single homicides. It's too premature and irresponsible to state that a serial killer is on the loose in Juarez," unquote.
And now these guys have a totally different opinion of the case. They say it's too early to say that there's a serial killer, and they might actually be single homicides.
Days after the FBI left Mexico, another girl was abducted. Miraculously, she would survive and give the police a whole new group of suspects to pursue.
Just days after the FBI leave, another girl is abducted, but this time she lives.
Yes!
The story she tells them is incredible.
A 14-year-old factory worker, only identified as Nancy, ended her shift at 1 a.m. She boarded the factory-provided bus that would drive her to the outskirts of town, where she lived in one of the city's many shantytowns.
She says that she ends her shift at work at around 1 in the morning. She boards one of those buses provided by the factories that drives to all the shanty towns.
That night, March 18, 1999, the other passengers departed at their stops, one by one. She was the last one left on the bus. Suddenly, she noticed that the bus was going in the wrong direction and was heading out into the desert. She questioned the bus driver, who told her he was having mechanical issues with the bus and was just looking for a service station.
And as they're driving, one by one, the passengers start to depart, and she's the last stop on the bus. And as they're driving, all of a sudden she realizes that the bus driver is going in the wrong direction. He's not driving towards any shantytown. He's not driving towards her house. He's driving her out into the desert. And the driver tells her he's having some kind of mechanical issues, and he needs to find a service station.
He then began to laugh as he pulled the bus off the road and onto the dirt. "Are you scared?" he asked, leering at her. She said he then asked her, "Have you ever had sex?" He approached and grabbed her by the throat.
But he pulls off of this dirt road and he begins to laugh. And he asks her, "Are you scared?"
Oh my God.
And she's only 14 years old. And he then asks her if she's ever had sex before. He approaches her, grabs her by the throat.
It was the last thing she remembered until she came to, lying in the dirt, bleeding and battered.
And that's the last thing that she remembers. Until she wakes up, lying somewhere in the desert, beaten and bloody.
She crawled along the dirt road to reach a small house with a porch light on. The occupants opened their door to see a young girl, bruised and bleeding, some of her clothes torn away. She was barely conscious. They called for help, and she was rushed to the hospital.
And she crawls and walks and makes it to a home, barely conscious, and gets those people to call for help, and she is rushed to a hospital.
In the year 2000, Vicente Fox became Mexico's new president. In late 2001, calling the killings in Juarez a national shame, he promised to involve federal authorities in investigating the murders. In February of 2002, they took over the investigation. 7 different special prosecutors had been in charge of the investigation, but no real changes or improvements in the tools of the investigation had resulted. They found that the public prosecutors continued to victim blame. One even went so far as to say that, quote, "women with a nightlife who go out very late and come into contact with drinkers are at risk. It's hard not to go outside when it's raining and not get wet," unquote.
So finally in 2000, Mexico got a new president, and in 2001, the killings finally received some recognition at a federal level. The new president orders an investigation into these murders, and what they start uncovering is basically there were 7 prosecutors assigned to the case. Through all 7, there were no real changes ever made to investigations, to anything that would actually move the cases forward. They saw that there was a ton of victim blaming, not only by the police, but by the prosecutors as well. There was a crazy quote by one of the prosecutors that said something to the effect of, yeah, well, what do you expect? These women were putting themselves in bad situations. They were going to bars and they were hanging out with gangs. And I think the comparison he made was you can't go outside when it's raining and expect not to get wet.
Oh my God.
Families were not kept informed of the investigation, not even when bodies were discovered.
They also found within these investigations that families weren't kept informed even when bodies were found.
President Fox appointed Maria Lopez Urbina as special federal prosecutor to review the homicide investigations in Juarez. In her report, she found that more than 125 state police officers were guilty of torture, abuse of power, and negligence in the Juarez murder investigations.
There was a federal prosecutor appointed to the investigation, and when all was said and done, there were more than 125 state police who were found guilty of abuse of power, torture, and negligence in the investigations.
Of the 205 murder files she reviewed, 101 had not gotten past the investigative stage. The report stated that notorious inactivity and negligence had led to the loss of evidence and the inadequate protection of crime scenes. In 29 cases, investigators had not collected fibers or other evidence at the crime scenes and had not interviewed key witnesses, including those who had discovered the bodies.
This federal prosecutor, to go back to show you what a bad job they did, it was not just ignorance, but intentional negligence, because of the 205 files that were reviewed in the Juarez murders, 101 of them never even passed the investigative phase. There was no activity into lead generation, and because of their negligence and their inactivity, it resulted in a loss of all the evidence. The cases end up stalling out. In 29 of these 205 files that they looked into, the police never even collected anything at the crime scenes, and they didn't interview a single witness, including the people who were actually discovering the body.